14. And it happened in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Ellasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goiim, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zeboiim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these came as allies to the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. Now for 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer, but the 13th year they rebelled. So in the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and struck the Rephaim in Ashteroth-karnaim, and the Zuzim in Ham, and the Emim in Shaveh-kiriathaim, and the Horites in their Mount Seir as far as El-paran, which is by the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En-mishpat, that is Kadesh, and they struck all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who were living in Hazazon-tamar. And the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah and the king of Admah and the king of Zeboiim and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, came out, and they arranged themselves for battle against them in the valley of Siddim, against Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goiim, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Ellasar, 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and they fell into them. But those who remained behind fled to the hill country. Then they took all the possession of Sodom and Gomorrah, and all their food supply, and departed. They also took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions, and departed. Now he was living in Sodom. Then a fugitive came and told Abram the Hebrew. Now he was dwelling by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, and brother of Aner, and these were in a covenant with Abram. So Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, and he led out his trained men, born in his house, 318 in number, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his men against them by night, he and his servants, and struck them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is the north of Damascus. And he brought back all the possessions, and he also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions, and also the women and the people. Then after he came back from striking down Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is, the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was the priest of God Most High. Then he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." Then he gave him 1/10 of all. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give the people to me, but take the possessions for yourself." Then Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have raised my hand to Yahweh God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal strap of anything that is yours, so that you would not say, 'I have made Abram rich.' I will take nothing except what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their share." Abram's character was tested multiple times. Back in chapter 12, verse 10, he ended up getting scared and lying to the Egyptians. But verse 17, Yahweh intervened so that Abram's sin does not carry through any farther than it did. In chapter 13, Abram was tested with an internal dispute. Verse 7, there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Abram was gracious and deferred to Lot, and then God jumped in and reinforced his promise to Abram. Verse 15, "For all the land which you see, I will give it to you and to your seed forever." And now in chapter 14, Abraham's character was tested, the capture of his nephew Lot. Verse 12, he also took Lot, Abram's nephew. Then in verse 14, Abram mobilized a mere 318 men and actually rescued Lot. And God's hand appears, the blessing from Melchizedek. Blessed be Abram of God Most High. In verse 20, blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. God has been very active for Abram. He called Abram back in chapter 12, and he never left Abram. If Abram does poorly, God still intervenes and minimizes the damage caused by sin. When Abraham does well in handling the internal conflict, God jumps in and elaborates on his promise. And then finally here in chapter 14, Abram now knows that he has nothing to fear because God is with him. If God's promise has to play out, then he cannot be killed. He will be victorious. And indeed, God was with him because, verse 20, God has delivered his enemies into his hand. The same God who was with Abraham is the same God today. He makes promises and he keeps his word. And when things get tough, when there's a famine, when there's conflicts, when there's loved ones in trouble, God is still with us. We can still trust him. Those are my thoughts. I hope to hear yours.